I know most of you on the list here. My name is Grant Walters. I'm the current GLACUHO past president. I'm currently at the Ohio State University. I really thank you for joining me this afternoon and coming to talk about the bylaws. I know it's a very busy time of the year for everybody. We're closing in a few days, so I understand that time is of the essence. And so I'm going to try to make this as efficient as possible and leave as much time as we need for questions. I also have a couple of members here from our bylaws task force who are helping me work on the document. And so I know Lori Berry from the University of Southern Indiana is on her way in. She's going to be a little bit late. Justin Shu from Southern Illinois University Carbondale is here. And also, well, actually, I think that might be it for the three of us right now. But Matt Bierman from Western Illinois also was helping us out. He's also a past president. And we also had Stephen Yeagley from Southern Illinois Carbondale as well, who was helpful in the whole process too. So this group has been dedicated for quite a few months anyway, in trying to help us get this document off the ground. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about just some of the reasons why we're looking at the bylaws and why it's important for us to consider these and vote upon them. Just to give you a little bit of history, for those of you who may not have been at the annual conference this year, we did not get to the bylaws because we had an exceptionally long elections process during our business meeting. So we weren't left with any time at all to be able to tackle some of this. But it's really okay because, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the specific sections that we identified as a problem, but our elections process during the business meeting sort of led us to make a few more changes. So I think it was sort of a blessing in disguise that we didn't get to voting on them at the annual conference because it gave us an opportunity to come back and review some things and make some changes that I think will be really beneficial for the association. So just to kind of give you a sense, thank you for coming again, welcome. So today's agenda, Eric already talked a little bit about how the webinar works, and so it looks like everybody should have audio at this point in time. If you're ready to ask a question, when I give you the signal, but I'll do raise hands and things like that and acknowledge you as best as I can so we can get you on audio to ask you some questions, and I'll try to respond to them in due process. So I'm going to highlight some of the major changes and revisions, and soon I'm going to switch over to the bylaws document, and I know that was sent out to the membership, and so hopefully you'll have a copy, but if not, I'll bring it up on my screen so you can kind of follow along and know what I'm talking about. At the end, after I just do some highlighting, we're going to go through some questions and answers, and then I'm going to highlight the next steps of the process and what happens from here in terms of voting on the bylaws and what the timeline is. So that will sort of be our agenda for today. So starting first and foremost, why we're making changes to the bylaws. So I started the task force last year when I was president because I saw a lot of problems with our governing documents. And for those who don't know, we tackled sort of three governing documents of ours. We took the conference planning manual and also our leadership manual as well as the bylaws, sort of our three central documents that we use in the association that govern our business. They had a lot of issues. There were flow problems, lots of typos, lots of grammatical problems, lots of outdated references, and so I really wanted to make sure that before we move forward with anything else that we took a look at those documents because we hadn't done a really great job in doing a comprehensive review. So the last major update to the bylaws took place in November 2009, so that's almost 5 years ago now, and that's when we implemented our new committee structure that now is unbelievably almost 5 years old. So that's why we wanted to review things, because we knew that at some point we had to take a look at the document as a whole. And there were some pieces that came together, so we made some changes to the document throughout the years, but we really hadn't done a comprehensive review, and that was sort of the goal of this year. There was a lot of outdated information, referred to titles of people on the board that didn't exist anymore, terminology that we no longer use in the association, acronyms that aren't really a part of our vernacular anymore. So we wanted to make sure that we did our bylaws some service and take those out so that people weren't confused by those associations because they were just not necessary in there anymore. Lots of grammar and spelling issues, just by simply cutting and pasting. There were some things that didn't belong in certain places. Problems with the flow of the document, and so the way that it was laid out and how each of the sections kind of flowed into one another, it made it really hard to read through the document as a whole and kind of get a sense of what was going on. And so we wanted to make it a bit more easy to follow and reference items and things like that as well. So we tried to rearrange some of the sections so that they flow a little bit better together, and it sort of the document flows, so you're starting out with a baseline and then moving into some of the more complicated pieces of the association and ending off with some of our major things that we could change in the future. So that was sort of our goal. We also needed revamping our approach to different parts of our work as an association, and so we really felt like, and I'll talk more about these outdated items and what we've done to change them. The document really didn't represent who we are and what we do as professionals any longer, and I think that even though the base of work of our association has remained the same for many, many years, I think that there were aspects of our governing documents that didn't suit our membership, and so I think the belief of myself and the tri-presidents and this group that was working on the bylaws was trying to ensure that this document was representative of what GLACUHO in 2014 looks like, and I don't think we were quite there, so that's why we decided to implement some of these major changes. So. Okay, so as I outlined in the document, I'm going to switch places here and just kind of bring up our bylaws. So this was the copy of the bylaws that folks had received via email, and so the big changes, as I highlighted in the email that I sent out to folks, were our membership and dues. And so what we really wanted to do, we had a really complicated and sort of an incomplete definition of what a member in GLACUHO actually is. And so I think we wanted to simplify that, and basically it sort of signifies that anybody who works as any staff or faculty member in an institution of higher education within the 4 states we serve that somehow is connected to responsibilities in college housing was somebody that we could serve as a member, and I think we had a really vague definition where, it was really loose before. So we really wanted to make sure that folks felt like that, they had an all-encompassing definition and that there was still some flexibility for who could be a member in GLACUHO, because we do have some of those staff members on our campus that serve different roles between housing and residence life and maybe some other areas of campus, and that's particularly prevalent at some of our private institutions where people wear a lot of different hats. And so we didn't want to exclude those folks, but we also wanted to make sure that people understood exactly, like, if I'm in GLACUHO as a member, what does that mean, and what do we value in our members, and what are we looking for in our members? So basically, members are defined as our institutions, and associate members are defined as employees of the member institutions. So we wanted to give some delineation there, because sometimes we'd use the word membership, and I think a lot of people became confused about, what's the difference between a person and an institution, so who becomes that? And that's especially important in our voting processes, because as it stands currently, and as it will continue in our bylaws, institutions are the ones that can actually vote. There aren't individual votes in the association, and so we don't have folks who come to a conference and every individual has a say in what happens. There's a representative vote from each of our member institutions. We wanted to make sure that people had that delineation in the bylaws, because that wasn't overly clear at that point in time. A really important part of our membership clauses that we changed was regarding public and private partnerships. And this has been a really hot-button topic in the association over the past few years, and there's been a lot of different opinions about whether or not we should embrace our officers that work with private partners or people that work directly in a private firm representing an institution. And there's been a lot of debate as to whether or not that's valued by our association, or are we about serving members who work in traditional institutions. And I think, for us, the board had some conversations about that. The tri-presidents have had some conversations. This task force had plenty of conversations about it. And I think where our values lie now, and where I think a lot of people landed, was that we really want to give the institution some ability to say who represents them. And so if I take, for example, an institution like Wright State University, Dan, I'm seeing you over there, who works very closely with private partnerships on their campus, and they run the entire facilities portion of their halls. We want Wright State to be able to decide whether or not the folks that work in those private partnerships to be able to represent them on a regional level. And so if they're working directly in housing and they're providing services for students and they're considered a housing officer by definition of our membership, we really want them to feel like they can participate in the institution, and we want Wright State to be able to determine, are these people worthy of getting professional development? Are we going to support them financially to go to GLACUHO? If they want to run for a position or they want to be a part of a committee, Wright State should be able to make the decision about whether or not that person participates. And we wanted to take GLACUHO out of the business of determining, who do we deem necessary and or legitimate as a housing officer. And I think we wanted to get away from that, because I think it was unfair for us to intervene. And I think that's the general sentiment of a lot of folks that were involved in this process. And so that's why we made some of those changes. And so now the membership is really responsible now for saying, if Mr. Smith is working in a housing enterprise with us, he's a valued partner, he's somebody who serves students in a housing capacity and a residence life capacity, and we want him to come to GLACUHO with us and join and be professionally developed by what the institute, by what the association has to offer, we're going to make that decision. And so that's really the crux of what the new membership information in the bylaws is trying to say. And so I'm hoping that makes sense for folks. I can certainly take more questions later on about that when we get to our Q&A period, but I wanted to give you a sense of where we were going with that. And I know that there are still going to be opinions out there about how valuable or detrimental or controversial those private partnerships are, but they're a reality for our member institutions. And I think as a housing association who really is focused on developing our staff members in order to serve students, I think we wanted to make sure that we weren't discriminating, and I think that was a big issue for us, and so that's why we've kind of implemented these clauses as we did. The next clauses that we worked on was after the business meeting this year, and we didn't initially, when we sent this document out for approval in November, we didn't talk a lot about the elections processes. We kind of left them the same in the bylaws. When we got to the business meeting, for those of you who don't know, we actually had 5 people running for the president-elect position this year, which was tremendous. It was a great turnout, and they were fantastic professionals, and I was really excited to see that kind of engagement. It caused some problems for us, though, because our bylaws basically said that we follow Robert's Rules of Order, and there aren't any exceptions to that. And so, as a president, that it sort of made me feel like I had to choose between Robert's Rules of Order or honoring some of the previous the procedure we've used previously in the association, which is to do a runoff election. And so when we had those 5 candidates running for positions, technically Robert's Rules of Order does not permit you to have a runoff election. So there was this conflicting set of values in the room as we started discussing business as an association, and what ended up happening was that the membership felt strongly enough that we wanted to have a cleaner election, and we wanted to make sure that we had a process that was a little bit more defined, and so they ended up suspending the bylaws, which was very difficult. And as somebody who was facilitating the meeting, I think that was a struggle that I had to kind of make a choice between what the association was expecting of me versus what the bylaws say. And I didn't want future presidents or future candidates to have to make that choice in the future. And so I wanted to make sure that we addressed that. And so we came back, and what you're seeing in the implementation of business is really giving the president some latitude to be able to make some decisions that are best for the association. And so listening to our membership, finding out what they're wanting, finding out what we think is fair, and then also being able to have good, clean runoff elections, having candidates who can be very clear about the process and what's expected of them. And that was really muddy in our bylaws before. And so a lot of Article 5 and then also down to Article 7 is really talking about some of those things and just clarifying those processes. And I think this will make it so much better and so much easier for future memberships and also future boards and future candidates to be able to run through an election that has clear expectations, clear guidelines, and has a fair vote. And I think that's important. I think we owe that to the people who run for leadership positions in our association. And so that's what the board came back with. That's what the bylaws task force came back with. And so in those particular articles, you'll see those changes in red. The other small pieces that we sort of implemented as well, if you look under both non-voting board members in Article 8, and then all the way back up here under elected officers, we've had some vacancies in the past several years on the board of directors, and sometimes those have come in the form of president-elect, sometimes those have come in the form of committee chairs, and other times it's been the past president who has had to leave their position. And it sort of left us wondering what we should do with that. And so we implemented some language and try to wordsmith some things that define that process a little bit better, that, should we ask a person to step down from their position, or should there be a vacancy because a person has either departed their position, no longer works in housing, no longer works in the region? What are some ways that we can address their vacancy, and how do we best do that that's fair, and, what's the process that we implement? And so you'll see some changed language above and beyond our past bylaws that address some of those instances, so that it just gives us a bit more, less ambiguity in working with some of those cases, so that we can reopen up those positions and look for good people to fill them. And this is just our ability to try to hopefully try to do that successfully with some guidance and whatnot as well. Down here as well, we also changed some language about our committees and task forces, and so it just basically defined the differences between committees and task forces because the language was kind of muddy again and who's responsible for those things. And very finally, we also came back down here to our non-discrimination policy statement, and we also made a couple of updates to the language based on feedback that we got from members and from the board. A lot of this had not included some more current terminology and also was not quite as inclusive, especially with issues of gender expression, disability, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status. So we kind of had an updated policy statement, and so I really tried to work on the advice of some of the board members and membership who gave us some feedback about what that could look like. So that was great that our policy is now a little bit more inclusive and includes some of those protected statuses that I don't think we had in there before, and I'm hoping that people feel a little bit more inclusive about that as well. So that, in essence, is our is sort of where we're landing right now with the changes to the bylaws. So those are our major changes, and I'm willing to open up the floor for questions now. I've prattled on for long enough, so now it's going to be an opportunity for you to ask any questions or if there's anything I can clarify. So feel free to raise your hand through the raise your hand icon. You can also submit a question if your audio is not working properly. You can also type in a question in the question box, and I can address that as well. But probably the easiest thing to do is to raise your hand, and I can respond, and I'll unmute you as we get there. So the first question is Vicki Dean from Southern Illinois, Edwardsville. So I've got you. Go ahead, Vicki.
Hi, Grant. In talking to my colleagues here on campus, one of the questions that came up when looking at the private private-public partnership section was about if we can just reiterate in that section that each institution gets one vote. I believe it's written elsewhere in the bylaws, but if we can just reiterate it when we're having that conversation, that was the feedback that our department had.
Sure. It's really good feedback, and you're right. We did address it in another section. If we feel like, I think part of our motivation was not to try to state things too many times in sort of a repetitive fashion in the bylaws, but I think it's a good conversation for us to have, and I think as we're sort of rethinking our materials when we send them out, recruitment stuff, I agree that I think that's a really good thing to do, and I think that's something we can also reiterate at election time as we're preparing schools to vote on different issues and take part in elections. I think that's something good to reiterate. Right now, I don't want to make changes immediately to the bylaws because I think that the version that's out there for voting and that people are considering right now doesn't have that sort of built into the new membership part of it. But that's something I think we can sort of implement later on, and we'll have some room to make a few changes between now and the annual conference as well. So that's something that if we don't make changes on immediately, we can also take into consideration and add that to maybe some improvements we can do before the annual conference. But it's a really great point.
Great. Thank you.
Good. Thank you, Vicki.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay, Dan from Wright State, I see you there. Just hang on one second. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, this is Daniel Schrader from Wright State. One of the questions that we had is, as you referenced our campus previously, we do have a company that is closely associated with and is what we would consider part of in-house. Within the area, there are also private companies that specifically their entire mission for their apartment complex is our Wright State University students. And from reading the membership section, it doesn't look like they would have a vote should they come to the annual conference.
Correct. It would be strictly the institution. So that's something that has not changed, that there's still one vote per institution. And so the officially registered institution, so Wright State University, would be the folks that still have the vote. And your senior housing officer would be the one to make the decision about who had that vote. And so we're still leaving that representation up to the institutions to decide. But you're correct. I mean, if there's a private housing enterprise that, is not connected to Wright State and they're not part of in-house operations, they wouldn't get a separate vote. And I think our reason for doing that is that our membership is still defined by institutions. And so, the definition of membership doesn't include, X apartment complex or X housing operation off campus that's still connected somehow, but doesn't serve Wright State University. So again, we want to leave the decision up to the SHOs and the institutions to decide who represents them, so who participates in GLACUHO. So they can certainly be at the conference, but they would not have a vote. So it would still be the senior housing officer of the residence life program at the institution that would still have the vote. And I mean, if they wanted to defer that vote to somebody at another institution, if they want to be able to include that person in the discussion, that's certainly up to them. But we left that open for the institution to be able to decide. So you are correct by that. And what we didn't want was having, 15 different buildings or complexes or private partnerships that were part of a campus having a vote, because I think that weighs things differently when we're just doing institutional voting and not individual voting, and so that's why we left it that way.
Was there any consideration by the committee to offer each individual company the opportunity to represent their company instead of being tied to an institution?
There wasn't a company. There wasn't a consideration for that, and I think that part of what we did think about that, and we thought about what if multiple companies represent an institution. So if it's American Campus Communities or Capstone that is at a certain institution and there's a partnership there, we talked about that, and we thought about if we're doing institutional voting at this point in time, and we're not doing individual voting, in order to carry out our business, we thought about, what happens if, one institution has 6 private partnerships that are available and one institution doesn't. I mean, does that kind of slide the vote unfairly? And we think it does in the in a representative voting model where it's 1 vote per institution. If Wright State is being represented by 6 different votes based on the fact that they have 6 different corporations helping them out, I think we talked about how does that slant the vote, towards another institution who just has a residence life program and only votes once. And so could that slant voting? Could that give folks an unfair advantage? Could it cause problems? I think that was our answer, that yes, it could. And so I think that at this point in time, our preliminary thought was, for the time being, if we're just trying to be inclusive, we wanted to make sure that we at least brought those folks into the room. But we haven't sort of talked about that. And I don't think it's that we're not open to future changes or modifications. This whole thing is really new to us. And I think that before, our stance has been, if you're part of a private corporation, you don't get to vote, you don't get to participate. And I think that's been decided upon differently at various times in the past about who can vote in the room, who has say in business, who can run for positions. And I just think at this particular point, we wanted to get out of that business of being able to say, private partnerships are not good for GLACUHO. We don't want them in the room when we're making decisions, so we're just going to make it strictly institutions. And I think we're trying to be more inclusive by doing that. But we didn't reach a point as a bylaws committee where we said, we think we should consider all these different entities that come under each of those things, other than getting them in, to participate and being able to provide them the services if that's what the institution says is appropriate. And so I hope that answers the question about why we were thinking that. Now, certainly there could be future discussion about changing that, and I think that we could certainly have more discussion about that, but I don't think that's where we're at the time.
Yeah, we were looking less at Wright State having a number of votes, and instead saying Capstone in all of their campuses gets 1 vote. So Capstone serves as the institution, or American Campus Community serves as the institution. And so whichever properties that they may be on, at however many campuses, they'd get 1 vote.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, and I don't think we have gone that far, because I think we still want the decision makers to be SHOs, and so. But I think certainly our SHO could make that decision that if the SHO says because we have American Campus Communities and we figure this person working for American Campus Communities might be the most appropriate person to represent our institution and bring it forward. I think that's certainly up to the SHO, and they can make that decision. But I wouldn't say that if there's a residence life department and then there's Capstone Management and then American Campus Communities on a campus, we wouldn't consider those individual institutions. I think we're still looking at the individual institutions being the college or university and not necessarily the private corporation. So the only way that they could have a vote is if the SHO deferred that vote to them and said, we're going to get Capstone Management because they represent the bulk of our housing program to serve as the voting representative, we're going to defer the vote to them, and they could do that in writing to the president, and that would be where we would include them. So I think that's what we were thinking of at this point in time.
Okay.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, any other questions? Oh, I'm sorry, I'm getting some other folks here. Okay, there's another question here from, actually Eric posed this question, and it's a good question. Eric, and I don't know if you wanted to talk. You're more than welcome to, but one of the questions was, could you speak to the complexity of a situation like the University Center in Chicago, where they represent multiple institutions? If two of those institutions are given the voting rights from their schools, would University Center then get 2 votes, 1 for each school? It's a really good question, and I think at this point in time, it's an odd, you're right, it is an oddity, and I don't know, we didn't talk specifically about University Center, but I think we considered them, and Bob Brophy, who's the director there, are in the leadership of the University Center. We've always seen University Center as one conglomerate. We recognize it's a conglomerate of places. So for me, this would sort of fall in the same place as, multiple companies working at one institution. Now, I think the door could certainly be open that if, at some point, I think there could be more discussion, but I don't think that's what we were believing, that a place like University Center, that they would represent multiple institutions, because we felt the conglomerate of being University Center and having one, having leadership would be the ones that would be representing. And so they've only traditionally shown up as members of University Center, and I recognize they could represent multiple campuses, but I don't think we talked specifically about them and about that complexity, because we believe that there would still be a central leadership that would make the decision about who comes and who would eventually have that vote that would represent their, the center. And so I don't think we we didn't get to that point yet in talking about that complexity, because it's never represented itself as different institutions, even though that's what it is that they've kind of come in as one conglomerate and have represented. But we sure did want to make sure that Bob and the University Center had representation, because there have been times when Bob has been told, like, you can't vote on legislation, you can't vote on officers that are coming to the association, even though you pay to come to GLACUHO and you pay to attend and you contribute and participate on committees, now you can't say anything about the business. And that's the thing I think we were trying to sort of represent. And so unless Bob were to identify, this is sort of how we break down, I think we could open the conversation for that in the future, but I think we were still thinking of them as one conglomerate. So, and it's possible, in the future we could have some of those institutions that come to us and say, we have multiple institutions that are represented here. What do we do? And that might be cause for us to re-examine the bylaws and talk again about, how do we become more inclusive of those things. But that, talking with Bob and sort of getting a sense of what he was looking for, we kind of didn't get to that point with him. So. And I don't know if that made sense.
Yeah. I think, Grant, and I apologize for having to submit the question in writing. I went and looked, and I don't actually have a raise your hand button, being that I'm one of your
it's okay. Don't worry about it.
organizers. So, I think it really was kind of a far-fetched situation, which could potentially happen. I know that
it could, yeah.
I work here at DePaul University, and we partner with University Center very closely. It's unlikely that DePaul would not send somebody that would vote on behalf of our institution. Deb is usually in attendance at all the conferences.
Right.
But what I was thinking is maybe some of the smaller schools. I know University Center has formal housing agreements for several campuses. I think Robert Morris University, Roosevelt, Columbia. And so I thought, down the road, what if there was a situation where one of those or a couple of those schools were not sending their own delegation and had authorized University Center to vote on their behalf? Would we have a situation where, like, let's say, and I don't want to pick on anybody specific, let's say Robert Morris and Roosevelt both said, we're not going, and we want University Center to represent us, and just how that would be handled. And it looks like, based on what's currently written, that would be okay, and I don't have a problem with that. I think that's fine. I just wanted to make sure that had been considered.
Yeah, no, and we talked a little bit about that, some of those interesting, what happens if you have proxy votes and stuff like that. I think we're still running under the assumption that, schools are going to still come to GLACUHO, and, the whole model of our, I don't know how it would work for proxy voting, because really right now the way that the bylaws are written and continue to be written is that you have to be present at the annual conference to be able to vote on business after the conference. And so that's why we're currently at this point where if your institution wasn't at GLACUHO 2013 in Indianapolis, that you don't have a vote on the bylaws. And I think people still felt that was fair to an extent because they felt like that was the only way we could sort of measure representation, because we don't really have like a formal membership process that brings people in and makes you register your school, and then you pay dues, and you have to do certain things to qualify your membership. I think we're very different than an organization like NACUR and GLACUHO, who have a very formal sort of membership process, and you pay, and there's a certain level of service you get with that payment. So I think we kind of said, if we open up voting for everybody, then a school that has never participated before can kind of come in and vote, and I don't know if that's necessarily a horrible thing, but I think we wanted to have some sort of accountability that that there was a little bit of, I think they wanted schools to be engaged, and part of that is trying to measure our membership by who was attending at our last annual conference. Now that's something that could change in the future, and as we start to do virtual stuff, and as these private partnerships play out, we may need to find ourselves changing the definition of our membership again. But we thought that this was at least a good starting point where we could at least be more inclusive, because the message I think traditionally to our private partnerships has been like, we're not interested in serving you. We think you're kind of detrimental to housing, and I think that's really that's not something that I want. That I certainly didn't want GLACUHO to represent anymore, but I think the feedback we've gathered from a lot of our membership and from the board and past presidents and the task force that worked with us is that that's a bad message for us to send, and that if they're working in housing and they're helping students, what difference does it make to GLACUHO, what role they serve on their campus, if they're private or public. And I don't want to shut people out like the University Center anymore, or other places who are legitimate housing operations that serve students, and being able to say, you don't get services from us, and we can kind of pick and choose what you get from GLACUHO. I think that was difficult, I think, for a lot of people to hear. I mean, we've gotten a lot of criticism for that over the years, and I think rightfully so. I think that's been a very difficult thing for our private institutions or private partnerships to really kind of stomach, and I think that we kind of wanted to be at a point where we're going to say, let's try this out, and we're going to be more inclusive, and who knows where that partnership could lead to, and hopefully it's a good outcome. We're going to try it, and hopefully that makes people feel more included and gives them access to things that they didn't previously have. So, okay, any other questions? Other things that I can answer for folks? These are really great questions. I really appreciate you all coming out and asking them. Okay. Oh, Daniel, hang on one second. Let me unmute you. Go ahead, sir.
One of the things that I noticed on the non-discrimination section may be beneficial to group similar discriminatory terms with one another. For example, we have gender expression and sex, and then the next line we've got sexual orientation.
Okay, I see what you're
And
saying.
marital status. So put all four of those together.
Okay, so it's just a matter of switching around the order.
Correct.
Yeah, I think that's fine, and Dan, that's a good suggestion. We can make some of those really sort of, I don't want to call it a benign change, but it's one that doesn't change the intent of the bylaws. So it's a matter of organizing language or correcting things. I think we have a certain level of ability to do that without sort of approval of the memberships. And since we're just sort of rearranging the order, I think we can certainly do that, and grouping like terms together. I think that's fine. That's something I can bring back to the bylaws committee, and I think we can kind of work that text to kind of read that. But I think that's perfectly fine. I think we can work with that. So I'm making note of that here. Thank you. Good. Any other questions? Other things that we can answer for you while we're here? I know. Okay. Well, just to let you know, so if there are other questions, you're more than welcome to continue to send questions to me, pastpresident@glacuho.org. I can continue to take questions throughout. Really what we're doing at this point is I really want folks to have the best information possible going forward as we approach a bylaws vote. And so, your institution will certainly speak based on its vote, yay or nay for the bylaws, but Certainly if you have other questions or require other clarification, if there are things that I can help you work through, I'm happy to talk via email or by telephone, so don't hesitate to contact me. And all of my information is sitting on the GLACUHO website, so feel free to use that. Where we're going to go from here is, again, this document's been out to the entire membership now for a couple of weeks, and it's going to continue to be out there. So we're continuing to hope that institutions are kind of batting it back and forth among their colleagues, and I'm really happy today that folks have been saying they've been discussing it with their colleagues and generating some questions, and I'm hoping that continues. So we're shooting for a target date of May 15th to be the start of the bylaws vote. And what's going to happen, because our membership voting is defined based on the annual conference from last year, the institutions that were at the annual conference last year will have a single vote, and they will have to select a voting representative, which most people traditionally do on their own, and the SHOs usually decide who that is, and so we're going to let that process continue. So it'll be an online vote, and we're going to contact the schools directly that were at the annual conference to advertise the vote, and we'll outline the process there. It'll be done electronically, and there'll be a choice of voting yes or no or abstaining from the bylaws vote. Abstentions really are for schools who maybe feel like they have a conflict of interest in voting for the bylaws, or maybe they don't have enough information. But we're asking everybody to submit a vote regardless, and so we're hoping that there's 100% participation. The voting will be open for about, I would say, 7 days, hopefully inclusive of 5 business days, so that there's some time for folks to, again, think about their vote and submit it, and just to kind of gather and send out reminders. So we're hoping that by May 21st, May 22nd or so, we can announce the result to the membership. Once the bylaws are voted on, they go immediately into effect, and so we'll be implementing those, and they will be the active governing document that we'll use going into summer meeting for the board of directors, and then also then for the annual conference in November. So when we walk in, we will not be making any changes to the bylaws past what has been done currently. If there's things that come up since then, anybody's welcome to write a proposal to change the bylaws. That's an association member's right to be able to do that. And so if there are additional changes that people feel need to be made to the bylaws, we can certainly tackle those at the annual conference, but we'll walk in using this current version that we vote in May. So any last-minute questions, other things I can answer before I let you all go? You've been very attentive, and I appreciate that for all my yammering. So. Okay. Well, seeing none, thank you so much for coming. I'm hoping this was helpful to an extent to clarify why we're making some of the changes. I'm hoping that I answered questions well. Again, please feel free to contact me if there's anything else that I can do for you. And I wish you all the best. I know folks are closing starting right now, including us. So good luck with everything. I really hope everything goes well. And by all means, let the tri-presidents of the board of directors know if we can help in any way. Great. Thank you, everybody.